Okay, welcome everyone. Sarah, do you want to take the stage?
Yes, my name is Sarah Martin. I'm a member of WAM, Women Against Military Madness, and the Solidarity Committee of the Americas. Some of my pronouns are she, her. And before many meetings, we do a land acknowledgement. And so I will do that, and then we'll go on with the although that's an important way to start the program. So we acknowledge that we are on stolen Dakota land. U.S. government seized the land in unspeakably brutal ways and have never made it right. The indigenous people continue to pay the price, and present policies with the higher rates of poverty, incarceration, police murders and brutality, and missing and murdered indigenous women and girls. However, indigenous people continue to fiercely resist, as they always have, including against Line 3 here in northern Minnesota. Today, 11 reservations are located within the state of Minnesota, 4 Dakota communities in the southern portion of the state, and seven Ojibwe communities in the north. WAM pays tribute to the Dakota and Ojibwe. So we are really lucky, honored, and thrilled to have Teri Mattson today to speak with us about the pink tide in Latin America and the many elections which have recently gone the left way. For those of you who may be new to WAM, just a minute of history. We just marked our 40th anniversary, and some of our first work, that was 1980s, was against the US wars in Central America in the 80s. As those wars were more or less resolved, WAM turned to oppose the many new US interventions around the world, including the first Gulf War, Yugoslavia, the sanctions and second war against Iraq, Afghanistan, always against Israel's criminal policies of Palestine, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, the blockade of Cuba, goes on and on. A couple of years ago, we upped our game in Latin America as US turned its deadly attention toward the South. We formed SCOTA, which I just told, Solidarity Committee of the Americas, and our first action was to reinstate the Saturday morning coffee hours of the 80s, featuring speakers up to date and active in Latin America and the Caribbean. For this coffee hour, Teri will speak for 20 minutes. We then have a list of questions of which you may not have covered, but we of course want yours. And you are all muted, as you say, and you will remain muted. So put your questions in chat. And for those of you who are watching Facebook, Kim DeFranco will be monitoring those. And Carla Reilly, our wonderful techie, is doing this, and so we thank her. But please go ahead in the meantime, introduce yourselves in the chat, your name and your organization, where you're from. And I will now turn it over to my co-host, Simon Elliott.
Good morning, everyone. First, let me just ask for your forgiveness. I'm in a coffee shop, so if there's some background noise, I apologize, but I'm taking the coffee hour seriously here. So I'm very honored, like Sarah said, we're very honored to have Teri with us today. So I will just briefly introduce Teri, and then we will start to hear from Teri, and which I'm really looking forward to. So Teri Mattson is the Latin American coordinator for Code Pink. Introduced to Mesoamerican anthropology and archaeology in the 6th grade, Teri's lifelong passion for Latin America has inspired 40 years of activism and travel throughout the region. The last few years include organizing and/or participating in political and social justice delegations to Colombia, Cuba, Ecuador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. In June of 2019, after a 3-month stay in Venezuela, Teri returned to the United States to work with Code Pink's Latin America team. Additionally, Teri is a founder and coordinator for the campaign to end US and Canada sanctions against Venezuela, a board member for Marin Interfaith Task Force on the Americas, and a principal activist with the Sanctions Kill Coalition. I'm going off script here, but I would also just like to say Teri is also the host of a wonderful weekly podcast called WTF is Happening in Latin America. It's a Code Pink podcast that I highly recommend that folks tune into. I know I tune in every week, and I've got some friends and family members who've started to as well. So with that, thank you so much, Teri, for having us, or for joining us, pardon me. We're happy to have you, and yeah, I'll turn the floor to you.
Well, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm speaking with you this morning from Mexico City, where I've been based since September of 2020. I'm so thankful for the invitation to speak this morning. And I just want to let all of you know that some of you I've worked with over the years. Sarah and my work has intersected in Venezuela, Simon in Washington, Venezuela, Honduras, and hopefully here in Mexico as well. So, and Marcy as well, our work is intersected regarding Cuba. So it's just really wonderful to be working with so many familiar faces this morning. And I'm really happy to share with you some of my personal experiences. I will say we're all very aware that, you know, the global context is changing hour by hour at this point. But what I would like to share with all of you today is my experiences this past 14 months. I've had the great honor and privilege to have traveled Latin America, being based out of Mexico, have traveled Latin America since the Bolivian elections in October of 2020, and finishing my travel end of January 2022 after the inauguration of Xiomara Castro in Honduras. So I think the best thing to do is maybe kind of just give an overview of what has happened, and particularly some of the things that I feel and have witnessed as being particularly important and maybe not emphasized enough in the North American press, but have been very, very important here in Latin America and the Caribbean. And also, I think you'll find that a lot of my emphasis indirectly is on Mexico. And I think we need to focus a little more as North Americans on the importance of the current president in Mexico and the Mexican people and the vision they have for themselves and how that is influencing the Americas as well. It's one of the countries we don't talk overtly about as being part of this evolution that we're witnessing in the Americas. So let me just begin with April 28th of 2021, which was the beginning of the National Paro in Colombia, which was a national protest against a narco-trafficking government. And it was very, very much an anti-neoliberal protest. I had the good fortune to be invited to participate on a human rights observation delegation to Colombia in May of 2022. I can tell you it was probably one of the most difficult trips I've done since being a human rights observer in Guatemala in 1984. It was particularly brutal and oppressive, violent. One thing that was not shared very clearly in the Western media was how large the participation was. It included when I was in Bogota one evening, there was a flash protest, and people, it was right during commuter traffic hours, and some of the cars that stopped and actually participated in the protest were people driving BMWs and Mercedes. And so this was a protest that was not just with the traditional rural communities, labor, social, indigenous. It also included people in white collar professions in the capital. So you were looking at attorneys, architects, university professors, dentists, doctors, all protesting as well. When we estimated about 72% of the country was dissatisfied with the current Colombian government. So that was huge and underreported, I believe, in the North. In June, we saw elections here in Mexico, regional and local elections, which would be in the states, like gubernatorial elections and mayoral elections. 500 seats were up for election. That was the largest election in the history of Mexico. The majority of the seats outside of the capital went Morena, Partido Morena, which is the president's party. The city itself, the capital itself, is split in half. I mean, it literally and figuratively, you could draw a line right down the center of Mexico City and see which part is neoliberal, private, conservative, and which part has leaned Morena. It is very, very clear outside of the capital that the majority of the country still supports the president and his vision for the development of Mexico and its people. They particularly support his foreign policy vision. And the foreign policy vision, I would argue, is developing more rapidly and more positively at the moment than the president is being allowed to transition domestic policy. But domestic policy also involves a lot of cultural changes as well, and not just here in Mexico, but in any country on the planet. And so that's going to be a little more complicated to do, but I believe the domestic changes will come once there's a greater foreign policy in place that is encouraging economic development for the people, and that in turn will help domestic policy. So I guess what I'm saying is the president's vision here is more of a macro economic policy, economic and foreign policy, which in turn will allow for the more domestic micro policy to develop. So macro policy first, which will be followed by a micro internal policy or expansion of it. So that was in June. And also in June, we all know that Pedro Castillo was elected president of Peru. He is from the provinces, again, outside of the capital. And we're also aware of the many obstacles that he's having in consolidating his presidency and the power behind that. But a huge change in the first time in Peru's democratic history that a left of center candidate has become president. And then returning to Mexico, 24th of July, AMLO gave a fantastic discourse, and it is available on YouTube. He gave a fantastic discourse at the here in Mexico City. The 24th of July was the 238th anniversary of Simón Bolívar's birth. And it was it's very important to note that he chose to recognize that day, and that he chose to invite foreign dignitaries, foreign ministers and presidents and throughout Latin America to join, as well as well-known international personalities, including authors and intellectuals attended this event. And he gave a really good, a good synopsis of Simón Bolívar's vision for the Americas. And then it had a beautiful segue into what is happening in current day Latin America and the Caribbean, flat out calling for the creation of a new institution recognizing an America for all Americans. And he basically was saying, down with the OAS, let's create something that is more egalitarian and more representative of an America for all Americans. He flat out overtly said that in July. And that was I'm not sure what other country that could come from at the moment without it being perceived as threatening versus visionary. And I think he was the perfect person to articulate that. And I think it was also extraordinarily important that it came from Mexico City. Again, not being quite as threatening or volatile of a statement coming from here, for better or worse. And we're talking about perception, particularly the perception of that statement in North America. So that was in July. And then in August, we saw Mexico City begin and host the Venezuelan dialogue. which is a significant accomplishment. I can say the dialogue has been played. I think they got through 3 rounds into September. August was the memorandum of understanding was signed, and then there were 3 rounds of talks in September, which have been put on hold, suspended, since the US kidnapped Venezuelan diplomat Alex Saab. That's a whole nother subject that we may want to have a coffee hour on, and an important one, you know, something to talk about diplomatic immunity and recognition of people's state departments and foreign ministries and all of that, and sanctions, of course, too, which has a large part of why he was arrested. He was by the way, extradited from Cabo Verde and is now on trial in Miami. So that was in August. We were all very, very excited to see that dialogue begin. We are hoping there will be a potential to resume it in September 8th, again, here in Mexico City. President AMLO, after a 4-year pause, reconvened CELAC. So there was a CELAC summit here. At the time, Mexico was the president of CELAC. It is Argentina is the current president. But in September, it was still Mexico. The summit was held here in Mexico City. And I would, and this is important, it was paused for 4 years. One of the biggest reasons it was reconvened was because of the situation in Venezuela, but also some of the economic situations arising. And there is also, and the timing of this was very important, and I think the Mexican president was very perceptive in this, the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean post-COVID, during COVID and post-COVID became very, very clear that the Northern Hemisphere countries had no interest, specifically the United States, no interest in helping its Southern Hemisphere neighbors. And that really, really helped, I would say. And I want to be careful how I explain this, because I don't want to make any particular country. It really helped create a humanitarian, or expand and recognize a humanitarian bond among Latin America and the Caribbean. Despite political and economic differences, there is a humanitarian bond during COVID, post-COVID, that's very, very strong. And I do think it's that bond that really allowed for the reconvening of CELAC and allowed for such enormous participation. I think only 2 countries did not attend. Colombia didn't attend, and I think Haiti, but correct me if I'm wrong. And I think all of you know that CELAC is a creation of Hugo Chavez, a vision of Chavez, a Bolivarian president, and all countries in the hemisphere belong to CELAC, with the exception of the United States and Canada. So there's 35 countries, so 33 of the 35 belong, 31 attended. The democratically elected government of Venezuela was invited, which means Nicolas Maduro did attend. I think that was a very savvy move of Mexico, recognizing the elected government. And I will also say the day that Diaz-Canel arrived from Cuba, this entire city was excited, regardless of politics. The recognition of Cuba's role during the pandemic, their international humanitarian and medical response to the world was dramatic and was overtly recognized upon his arrival here in Mexico. So then also in September, we had opening week of the United Nations General Assembly. That was September 21st, I believe. And a few days after the opening, 18 countries, known as the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN, signed a declaration to uphold the founding principles of the UN. This is really, really important. And let me tell you, of those 18 countries, it's important to note that of the 18, that includes Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. So this is a declaration to uphold the founding principles of the UN. It's no coincidence that this happened last September. Then going into November, we saw multiple elections throughout the hemisphere. I am happy to say, honored to say that I was invited, and Simon was as well, invited to be an international observer in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Honduras. Let's start with Nicaragua. The 7th of November were the presidential elections in Nicaragua. We saw President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo re-elected. On the 14th of November, we saw Argentine legislative elections, which had a very disappointing result for many of us, and that is a whole another election to dissect and the fallout of that in Argentina today. 21st November were Venezuela regional elections. Again, regional elections in Venezuela would be similar to what gubernatorial and mayoral elections would be in the United States. Also on the 21st of November were first round presidential elections in Chile. The 27th of November were Honduras presidential elections with Xiomara Castro winning by a huge majority. And then in early December, we saw second round elections in Chile, resulting in a slightly left of center presidency in Chile. And the president's very young, 35, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. And so this is a fascinating result in Chile as well. So let's talk about, and tell me if I'm boring you, if there's anything more, if I'm getting too detailed or if I'm doing okay. So I want to, with as many elections that occurred in November, my general, and I think just being on the streets in these countries could really feel, and you could see the electoral participation, really feel the emotions associated with the electoral results. And I would define the results in November as being: one, people voted to preserve national sovereignty. So they voted against interventionism. And I would also argue they voted against balkanization. And I say they voted against balkanization because one of the things, in addition to national sovereignty, that people throughout the hemisphere voted for, they also voted for national resource sovereignty. And I think that's very huge to understand, for people in the North to understand that people in the South do understand colonialism very clearly. They understand that their natural resources and the extraction and exploitation of those resources has to be stopped. And so it was very much natural resource sovereignty as well as national sovereignty. And then also those candidates that won, and won by a large majority, represented a political and economic plan benefiting all citizens. In other words, these were candidates that promoted state-managed economies versus neoliberal privatized economies. And those candidates won by a large percentage, and they won from a very enthusiastic participation of voters. So it's really important to understand how well the average citizen in Latin America understands interventionism in all its forms, not just hot warfare, but economic warfare as well, how they understand colonialism historically and in its current context, how they understand unilateralism versus multilateralism. You can talk to pretty much anybody on the street about all of those things. And so it's a very well-informed, through personal experience, a very well-informed voting public, and the election results in November really clearly show the sentiments of the voters and which direction they want to take their countries. And because so many voted in this direction, you can see, an evolution happening throughout the Americas. So there were two, well, I guess maybe three elections in November that we should specifically focus on. One, the re-election of Daniel Ortega on November 7th. And let me just quickly say some of the things that happened immediately after his electoral win, which was the 7th of November. And so that was a Sunday. There was a celebration in Managua on November 8th, and then which was a Monday. And on Wednesday, I think it was, the Nicaragua petitioned to leave the OAS. This is a 2-year process, so they still have responsibilities, diplomatic responsibilities to the OAS, which I would argue they will do an exemplary job at. But they are leaving, and they may not be the only ones at this point. A week later, they re-recognized the People's Republic of China. I say re-recognize because the first Sandinista government in the 80s did recognize the People's Republic of China. It was the neoliberal government, 16 years between the two Sandinista governments, that recognized Taiwan. And the first administration of the second Sandinista government did continue to recognize Taiwan. Now, the second administration, they have overtly recognized the People's Republic of China, and in that recognized Taiwan as part of China. This is important going forward too, as we watch perhaps the United States opening up a two-front war in Europe and in the Pacific. And so Taiwan's going to be very, very important, and Nicaragua, recognizing the People's Republic of China is going to be very important. Also in November, just before the elections, I think it was the Wednesday prior, the White House signed, President Biden signed the Renaissance Act into law. Some of you may know the Renaissance Act is a very, very strong regime change sanctions bill against Nicaragua. It was introduced in May, simultaneously introduced to the House and the Senate in May. It moved very quickly, although many of us tried to stop it, or at least soften some of the language in it. It moved very quickly through both chambers and was signed into law the Wednesday before the presidential elections. Some would argue that was overt electoral interference. It's a very, very aggressive sanctions regime. And then let's just stay with Nicaragua, and then I want to go back to Venezuela in November and Honduras as well. And then in January, oh, Renaissance. Yes, I see that. Mary's asking me to spell Renaissance. There, thank you. Thanks, Simon. I was honored to be invited to the inauguration in January of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo. That was the 10th of January. And let me just tell you who was there, because I think this also plays out to this evolution in the Americas, but also what's happening today in Eastern Europe. So diplomatic invitees included Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, China, Seren from El Salvador, and Juan Orlando Hernandez from Honduras. The audience included solidarity movements, labor movements, and political parties. And I want to mention something very unique about the political parties, especially with Juan Orlando Hernandez being one of the diplomatic invitees and attendees. In the audience was a very large contingent of Partido Morena, or excuse me, Partido Libre from Honduras. Morena was there as well. But the Partido Libre people had a huge red banner that said "Fuera Ho." And during the inauguration, they stood up, or right before it started, I think they stood up and, were chanting "Fuera Ho, Fuera Ho," waving their banner. They were not told to sit down. They were not told to be quiet. They were not escorted out of the audience. They were allowed to express their political sentiment. And I think that this is really, really important for people to understand the tolerance of the Ortega government, and also that both the National Party and current president and then current president of Honduras was invited, and there's foreign policy and economic reasons for that, but also that the incoming president's party was clearly represented in the audience and was allowed to voice its political opinion peacefully. I'm not sure that would happen in the United States. I think, you know, some of us have been escorted out of events for expressing, you know, an opposing opinion. So I just want to share that one little specific thing. Also, the night of the inauguration in Managua, President Ortega announced a memorandum of understanding between Nicaragua and China for Nicaragua to join the Belt and Road Initiative, which potentially includes green energy development, which now that does include, I think that was signed last week, food production capacity, and a deep water port on the Caribbean coast, which has led many people to conclude that the canal, the transoceanic canal, will be constructed as well. But this deep water port on the Caribbean coast is something really, really important to understand for Nicaragua to be connected with the East and the West, but also for all of us to see if a port built in partnership with the Chinese on the Atlantic coast of Honduras could sail potentially, could send ships to Venezuela, which is also an ally of China, and then of course across the Caribbean to Cuba and back. So you can see this creation of a, well, I say a trade triangle with the East, with China, and potentially Russia too, between those three countries aligned with China. And this is really really important to understand as to why these sanctions currently placed on Russia. Russia is a very strong ally, as is China, with all three of those countries, and those sanctions against Russia are going to very, very much hurt Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Okay, so now I want to go back to November, because I think it's really also important to understand what happened in Venezuela. Outside of the capital, the PSUV, the state party, the president's party, President Maduro won the majority of the governorships. Again, people voted anti-intervention, and if anyone understands interventionism so clearly and can share it with you, you can talk to anybody in the subway in Caracas and outside of the capital as well. People really understand US aggression. And this goes all the way back to the days of Simon Bolivar. They can talk with you about interventionism quite articulately, and they clearly voted against that. And one of the things we heard on election day over and over again was sovereignty is not negotiable. And the threat of losing national sovereignty has united the Venezuelans, with the exception of the more radical right, the Guaido right, the US aligned right, has really united Venezuelans. They are Venezuelans first, political parties second. And I cannot emphasize that enough. We do not talk about that enough. And we certainly don't hear it from Washington. So this is really big to understand what's happening among the people in Venezuela. And then at the end of the month, Simon and I were in Honduras. I have to say it's probably the first time, it was certainly since the coup in 2009, that you could actually feel a real sense of alegría, happiness, hope, positivity among the Honduran people. The election turnout was enormous on the 27th of November. Election day was peaceful, enormous turnout. And I would say that has a lot to do with long-term party building, Partido Libre party building, since the coup in 2009 and specifically since the elections in 2013. It has to do with coalition building, which also was the success of AMLO's election here in Mexico. The Partido Morena is also a coalition, not just a party. The other thing that was really clear on election day in Honduras was that the left has to win, unfortunately, has to win big, has to win by a large percentage in order to avoid any sort of manipulation of the outcome, in order to avoid the opposition contesting the election results. There was nothing at the close of the polls on the 27th of November in Honduras. There was nothing that could be contested. What was up for grabs was the composition of the National Congress. The one thing that was extraordinarily controversial late afternoon on election day was the shutdown of the, and I forget what it's called. I can get the electoral bodies confused between Venezuela, Honduras, and even here in Mexico. But the electoral body, the website that you go to confirm that you are registered to vote and where in your polling center, that shut down late afternoon. And late afternoon is another surge in voting, and that's traditional throughout Latin America, where you will typically see older people vote first thing in the morning. And not exclusively older people, but older people generally do vote first thing in the morning. Voting eases off as people go to church and have their Sunday family meal. And then there's an uptick or resurgence in voting late afternoon before the polls close. So the website went down before this second surge in voting. And that's a really simple fix if it was not manipulated as the National Party claims it wasn't. It's a simple fix to just for the new government to invest more money in upgrading the server capacity for that website for the next round of elections. Also, I think probably all of you have noticed as we've talked about the November elections, all of these elections were held on a Sunday, unlike in the United States. And so that's really makes it very easy for people to vote. They have the day off. You can vote at your leisure, and you don't have to worry about taking time off work. What do you do as a student attending classes? What do you do for childcare, et cetera, et cetera. Sunday is the day to vote, and that also encourages a large turnout. So what happened in Honduras in January after the inauguration? Xiomara Castro was inaugurated the 27th of January. I was honored to be there. I will say the foreign dignitaries that attended, it was enormous. The inauguration was held in the National Stadium. When you walked in, the bleachers were, bleacher seating was reserved for Honduran citizens. Anybody could attend. People came from all over the country. The line to get inside the stadium was 2 days long. If you did not have I mean, I don't want to say if you didn't have an attendance, the Honduran people had, as a population, had the invitation from the president to attend. And it was a 2-day line. And when you walked into the theater, the bleachers were a sea of red. It was enormously powerful, enormously emotional, and so overwhelming. And to see the Honduran people excited about their government and hopeful for the future of their country. Kamala Harris did attend to represent the United States. There was a parade of dignitaries. Literally, they came in through the entrance and paraded through the stadium and up to the podium where the inauguration was going to take place. Almost all of the foreign dignitaries participated in that parade, with the exception of the US Vice President. She entered in an armored vehicle, one of those big black SUVs. And when she entered, the entire stadium started shouting in Spanish, "Take him with you," meaning take Juan Orlando with you when you leave. It was not a pleasant welcome, nor should it have been. They also will say when she was introduced, President Castro was very, very, and I interpreted this as a really important political message, and also a message for female leadership in the Americas. When Kamala Harris was introduced, the president also introduced Dilma and Cristina, who were there as well. And so the three women were introduced together. I think that showed a real multipolar approach to her politics, also a clear recognition of female leadership, and perhaps a message to Kamala Harris that, you know, these two women are leading slightly different movements for their people, and, you know, take note. So what else did I want to tell you about? I hope there's been some continuity trying to weave what happened in November with what, you know, with the inaugurations in January. Oh, I should say with January, with Xiomara Castro's inauguration, and when we saw immediate results, foreign policy moves after Ortega was reelected, the morning of the 27th, Xiomara Castro was inaugurated. That afternoon, the very first foreign policy decision she implemented was to recognize the Maduro government of Venezuela, to reopen the Venezuelan embassy in Tegucigalpa with the Maduro government's foreign ministry. This is huge. And it was and especially since it was the very first foreign policy decision she enacted. It's a message of multipolarism. It's a message of inclusivity. And it's also really, really important. It's a very strong message to the United States, and almost shocking to some of us that was the very first thing she did, but very, 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 very exciting. What also has happened since her inauguration was the amnesty law did go into effect, and that did lead to the release of the Guatemala 8, the water protectors that were in the village of Guatemala that were protecting themselves against the development of mining and a hydroelectric dam. So this is big too, and that happened the same week, last week. No, that happened the 24th of February, I believe, maybe sooner. But this was all, you know, happened around the 6th anniversary of Berta Cáceres' assassination. And so, as they like to say in Honduras, you know, she was assassinated for protecting natural resources. And this is, again, the recognition of natural resource sovereignty. She was assassinated, but her death planted seeds, which led to the protesting, you know, this huge protestation of the Guatemala 8, who now have been released from prison after 914 days in prison under the Juan Orlando government. So there's some really, really hopeful things happening in Honduras. I think what all of this over the past 14 months has shown us in the United States, I hope, is that there is this death of unilateralism in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm not sure it's the rise of multilateralism, especially now with what's happening in Eastern Europe. It may be the reinstitution of bilateralism, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I don't want to see us go back to a Cold War, but nevertheless, it is the end of unilateralism. Whether bilateralism reemerges or multilateralism reemerges, we don't know yet, but there is an enormous evolution. And I think that that's happening among the Americas, even considering the diversity of political and economic interpretations of progressivism and leftism. It's a spectrum. It isn't, one specific paradigm that's emerging. It's a spectrum of progressivism to leftism based on a country's culture and history, and what is also politically achievable in this particular moment. But it's very, very exciting. And so many of us are hoping it doesn't get quashed now. It could offer a real resistance and balance to what's unfolding in Europe. So it's there's some real evolutionary possibilities here now. And I think we should be uplifting that and celebrating that and supporting people on the ground who are making this possible within their countries through, the electoral process, which is really, really important to note that these election results happen via constitutional means through the electoral process, which allowed for peaceful transitions of governments versus violent. And that's specifically notable in Honduras, and an enormous achievement for them. So maybe I'll leave it at that, and we can talk some more. I mean, I'm interested to hear what all of your perceptions are of what's happening in the Americas right now.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that wonderful overview you gave, and I also appreciate that you took a wider view of starting, with the return to power of the MAS party in Bolivia in October 2020, and then going all the way through some of these incredible inaugurations in January, kind of a long 2021, if you will.
Well, it's been really remarkable, really, since, well, we could even go back, to the coup in Bolivia in October of 2019, which CIPER has done so much work about. And, that comment, Simon, talking about the MAS in Bolivia, and I also think with this unites Mexico and Honduras, the need to build a huge social movement, labor, political, and social movement, and have the party and its candidates come out of that, so that there is enormous support throughout the country. And that really, really is what, in my opinion, is what allowed the MAS to come back to power in October of 2020, because whether your party is in power or not, and you're not always going to be in power, but it is necessary to have that base that is in power among the people throughout the country, whether you're officially holding office or not. That was very, very important for the mobilization of Morena here in Mexico, and remains so today, and was also directly responsible for the election of Xiomara Castro in Honduras. And I would argue also for Pedro Castillo in Peru, although the movement hasn't stayed behind him in Peru.
Yeah.
I would argue that's part of the problem in Peru.
And yeah, picking up on that a little bit, you started to pull out some common themes that we've seen among the left that have won these elections, including, you talked about the need to preserve national sovereignty, resource sovereignty. You talked also about a lot of these candidates, their platforms and the movements were about making economies that worked for people. So I'm wondering, if you wouldn't mind expanding more on that, about what else is it that unites all these kind of disparate movements to throughout Latin America that have come to power in the last year. And also another question that I have is kind of why now? Why do you think that there's this resurgence that we've seen, such a strong resurgence in the last year and a half, and even maybe going back to when Argentina, when Macri's party lost in Argentina? But if you wouldn't mind, if you see any more common threads and what kind of potentially unites this new pink tide, if you will.
I don't think the pink tide ever fully went away, first and foremost. I will say though, I do believe the lack of response from the North, specifically the United States, lack of response to Latin America and the Caribbean during COVID had a huge impact on the resurgence of electing governments promoting economies for the people. And I think that was so clear to me, and maybe perhaps understated during the SELAC conference or summit here in Mexico in September. It was really, really clear there is a unity, a humanitarian unity in Latin America and the Caribbean on a level that I have not seen in my lifetime. I don't, historically there's been many, many different unions with people, but with countries, but I really, really do believe the lack of response, the lack of a human response by the United States, from the United States to Latin America and the Caribbean has united these countries in a way, in a humanitarian way. And that humanitarian unification has now led to these, broader conversations among all of them. One of the things that was fascinating to me with the SELAC conference, and this shows some of the differences among the political and economic differences among the countries, but still this desire to unify. Two of the comments that were stark to me were the comments at SELAC by Ecuador's president, Lasso. Now, we all know Lasso's a neoliberal, but he said that he wants his country, he wants to bring economic development to his country for all people. Of course, for him, that means in a privatized structure, but that he wants his country to be free to trade openly with Russia, China, and the United States. He wants to abandon unilateral trade with the United States and be open, be free to trade unilaterally with the West and the East. That's coming from the current president of Ecuador. The other person that really surprised me, despite how we feel about El Salvador and what's currently going on there, their vice president attended SELAC, Ulloa, U-L-L-O-A is his apellido, Ulloa. He was extremely articulate in his comments. He's younger, and I emphasize that because I really support these governments that are electing young leadership. They have a different geopolitical vision. They've grown up differently than people, of my age who grew up affected by the first Cold War. And also these younger governments are fully integrated with modern technology, and not just social media, but economic technology, cryptocurrency, etc. And I think that's a whole, generational thing opening up that is very exciting. So the vice president of El Salvador spoke, and he opened up his comments saying, look, the OAS was created at the end of World War II. It was created in a paradigm of East versus West, a distinct political and economic paradigm of East versus West. It is a tool of the first Cold War. It expelled Cuba, he said this, it expelled Cuba in 1962 simply because it had a different political and economic philosophy. And then he went on to talk about Bolivia and OAS. He didn't mention Almagro by name, but how the OAS intervened there, how it had intervened in Honduras and throughout the hemisphere. And he basically said it has no credibility. We don't need it. He said, SELAC is an existing institution. It's currently functioning. It operates, it exists, and it functions in a positive manner. We can use it to create a unified economic bloc to engage with the rest of the world. That was from El Salvador. So recognizing the OAS isn't any good for any of us, and recognizing that CELAC already exists and that it's efficient, and that there is currently there is this humanitarian unity and common vision to create an economic bloc beneficial for all of them, and that economic bloc would operate in a multilateral fashion. So it's so you see those two countries saying things of that nature, and then of course, you know, we have Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, who already are allied and trade with Russia, China, Iran also. You see Bolivia, perhaps Peru. Peru's largest trading partner is China. Who am I forgetting? Brazil. So it's, you know, this multilateralism is already a reality in the Americas. It's already a reality. It's and you know, I don't know what Washington is going to do at this point, given the, you know, what's going on in Ukraine. You can bet, as I mentioned earlier, these sanctions, these really super harsh sanctions on Russia, are definitely, the intent is to have the repercussions of those sanctions affect Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua for reasons that I explained earlier. So I don't know, Simon, does that help with talking about the economic differences? And I mean, you know, the Americas has a real, it's a spectrum of, you know, centrist to progressive to leftist, and it does depend on what the people want and what, you know, and what's possible to move, you know, politically on an agenda as well. But the multilateral philosophy is there.
The presentation was incredible. I mean, it was so, your overall presentation of what's gone on is so clear, and as well as the wonderful detail of what you've seen and what you've experienced there. We really thank you for it. It's just been wonderful.
Well,
and picking up on some, and one thing that occurred to me is this the first time in Latin America where it's happened in so many countries? It's, you know, Cuba's been standing there alone since 1962 and somehow managed to weather all of this. And there've been fits and starts, and certainly before Cuba, other countries have tried to go their own way and been squashed by the US. But this time it seems like it is just so big, and the US stupidly embroils itself in Ukraine now, so is distracted once again, and has been distracted anyway, I guess, which has allowed Venezuela to. But anyway, is this the first time that there's been so much shift and movement in Latin America, which is making this possible? And then along with that, what governments, you would think Honduras and that comes to mind for me, are particularly susceptible to US interference now? Soft power and color.
I would say Mexico.
And Mexico.
I would say Mexico is very quietly and very subtly being placed in the crosshairs of the United States, principally because, you know, it's a border nation, and it does. I think, as I shared with some of you before we went live a week or so ago, the Mexican president has a press conference every morning, and an update, domestic and foreign policy and economic updates. And one of the things he said a week ago was that that he overtly requested in the media at this press conference was for the United States to back off of financing well, how do we call it? You know, he didn't flat out mention USAID and NED, but organizations of that type that the United States funds to infiltrate social movements, labor movements, political party movements. He did overtly tell the United States to stop doing that here in Mexico. I don't know how loudly and widely that was heard in the United States, but it was a specific statement made to the press here last week. And also, I think, Sarah, you mentioned to me the CDC
That's right.
post about Mexico being particularly, volatile to come, or dangerous to come to. I've been here since September of 2020, using the subway, using the airport, using, buses. I'm still testing negative. So
One of
there.
One of our thoughts was that the reason that's happening is because Mexico and Cuba is another one that's been upgraded to a dangerous nation. I don't even know if they've had a case in a week. And several of us were there actually last week, and we'd hoped that Teri would be there, but
I know. I've been all over. Yeah,
you have been. We changed the date, so that made that impossible. Anyway, because Cuba and Mexico are not using U.S.-made vaccines.
Yes. I can personally address that.
Okay.
I mean, well, first of all, Cuba being on the CDC list is just simply ridiculous, because over 90% of their population has been vaccinated. I mean, it's just, so they're preventing the spread of COVID among themselves, and they're also a perfectly safe, population to go visit. But regarding vaccines, this vaccine apartheid, as some people want to, call it. So I've been here in Mexico, based here out of Mexico City since September of 2020, and have watched the U.S. immigration policy evolve or devolve, I guess, to return home. And I hadn't been back to the States until December of 2021. And I was vaccinated here in Mexico with Sputnik 5, which is not recognized, the Russian vaccine, which is not recognized by the United States. So in December, to get back to the States, I think the policy at that point was being vaccinated by a US recognized vaccine or a negative PCR test with the swab no older than 24 hours. So I had to get I had to have a PCR test to go back to the States, even though I was fully vaccinated. I was fully vaccinated with a Russian vaccine. After the January trip, I did go back to the United States for the month of February, and to leave Honduras and enter the States, the law had changed again, where even if you had a US recognized vaccine, you still had to have a negative PCR test. You had to have both. So some people would say that, first of all, it's very clear what the pharmaceutical industry is doing. You buy these US, manufactured vaccines versus those produced in Cuba or Russia. And also, in my opinion, it's a migration control tool as well, because it's really, even for middle class families now, it's extraordinarily expensive to get either ground transportation or air transportation. And now every member of the family has to have a PCR test as well, which, in order to get a test with a quick turnaround, which you have to have because the swab can't be older than 24 hours, that's a really, really expensive test. Over $100, over $200 in some places, more than that. So it is, I think it could be interpreted as a migration control thing as well. It's like, oh, the Biden administration has made it easier for people to enter the United States, but then, behind his back, he's made it financially impossible for people to enter the United States. So, on face level, it looks positive, but the reality is it's even more difficult to go to enter the States now, even for its own citizens, myself included.
Yeah, and if I may, going back and pulling a thread from Sarah's question as well, and I really appreciate the focus that you have on Mexico, and with Sarah's question about kind of like what is different this time in terms of regional unity and for regional integration and kind of a leftist bent. I think one of the things that I've heard people talk about that is very different is the fact that Mexico is now involved, that in the first pink tide there, Mexico was not a part of that. And that, you know, there was the centralizing figure of Hugo Chavez, who unfortunately is no longer with us. But that Mexico now, with the economic behemoth that it is, the size that it is a major difference in terms of how successful regional integration projects will be. And then the other thing, and maybe this is looking forward a little bit, our 2020 preview, which we advertise this event as well, is the potential electoral victories, the elections that are coming up in Colombia and Brazil, which both have candidates who are left of center in Lula in Brazil and Gustavo Petro in Colombia, which, you know, to have the potential of left of center governments all the way from, you know, Buenos Aires, Rio de la Plata, all the way through Brazil up to the Rio Grande would be a completely different terrain, as you were saying, Sarah. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts. We're dying to know which elections you'll be traveling to in this year. So do you have any thoughts about what those two elections might look like, or, you know, the role that Mexico also has in?
Well, I want to just backtrack on your first. We should recognize that today is the anniversary of Hugo Chavez's death.
Oh.
It's March 5th, and he died March 5, 2013. So I just want to, you know, pay homage to him and his vision and leadership, because we are still experiencing, you know, his vision is continuing to unfold. And so I just want to recognize that, particularly for any of the Venezuelan solidarity people watching, and for anyone from Venezuela. Yeah. So, and then what's changed and made this evolution towards multilateralism possible in the Americas? I will say, and Simon can speak very strongly towards this as well, given his relationship with CEPR, U.S. economic warfare, unilateral coercive measures, or what we know as economic sanctions. That's had a big influence on creating alliances among countries that the United States would prefer not exist. And it's like, I was reading this article. There's a really good article by, I forget the name of the article, but the economist is Michael Hudson. And I have followed him for many years because of my work in Venezuela. And I think he understands sanctions and can articulate the ramifications of sanctions on a really easy to understand level. But one of the things he mentioned in a recent article, he sarcastically said, you know, please de-dollarize. Like the United States is through this economic warfare is forcing nations who may not otherwise unite among themselves, have to for trade purposes, and also have to get off the US dollar and out of the SWIFT banking system. And the US's foreign and policy and war policy using these economic weapons is forcing the world to restructure off the dollar. It's like it's like the US is saying, well, I'm creating the universe that I'm trying to avoid from emerging. So trying to prevent the emergence of a multilateral world, they're actually creating it, and they're also creating the de-dollarization of the planet, I believe. So, and also, as I said earlier, specifically for Latin America and probably Africa too, but I don't know enough. I'm sorry to say enough about the African continent, but also the lack of response to COVID by the Northern Hemisphere has created this evolution in the Americas as well. But sanctions US unilateral coercive measures is, is creating alliances across the globe that perhaps would not have, come on so fast or so strongly. I think eventually would have come, but really, very strongly. And then you asked me about elections in Colombia and Brazil. I hope I get to go to both. I'm very selfishly saying Brazil, I think, because of their current government, I think it's pretty clear that people will make a change towards progressivism. Colombia is going to be really difficult. I would like to say, I think first and foremost, we have to again recognize the fact that Colombia is a member of NATO. And that is not, a mistake. They have a Caribbean coastline and they have a very large 3,000 mile long border with Venezuela, who is allied with Russia, China, and Iran. So it's not a mistake that Colombia is a NATO partner. And they have a Caribbean coastline. So, and again, going back to that triangle between Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, I don't know. I don't know what to say about Colombia. I want to be hopeful. I want to say because of the national paro, what that unveiled was that such a large percentage of the population is against neoliberalism, is against the narco trafficking government there that they have now. I mean, when you're looking at people inside the capital, people who are middle class, and even in some cases upper middle class, stopping in a flash, protest during commuter hours and joining, the protest, that's huge. And that is that demographic of people against the current government in Colombia. That demographic is not shared in the United States, except among people like us. I mean, I don't think you would ever read that in mainstream Colombia, that professional people, with fancy cars and fancy houses want to change a government. So it's, when you've got that large of a percentage of the population dissatisfied with its government, that explains why the repression in Colombia is so enormous. It's not just against the traditional protesters, it's against, middle class people now too. And because it's such a large dissatisfaction, the oppression is enormous. The tactics that these ESMAD squads use, those are the, what do you say, their squadrons, their disbursement, like riot patrol, or their protest disbursement squads that they call them. Those squads disperse protests that are peaceful even. What they do is when a gathering, whether it's a musical gathering, an art festival, political, whatever, labor, regardless of whether or not the gathering is peaceful, when it gets to a certain size, these ESMAD teams are called in by the government to disperse. And they try to come in from all four sides of an event, but generally are pushed back on one side, which is called the Primera Línea, which is where all these young people are protesting and keeping the ESMAD teams out, so that they create like a way for people at an event to exit without getting harmed. But they come in on all four sides, and they come in, their gear is military grade gear. You would swear you were on a battlefield. They come in with tear gas, and they shoot and they shoot and they shoot. They do not shoot to disperse. They don't stop shooting once the crowd stops dispersing. They shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot until, everybody's gone, or sick from the tear gas. It's extraordinarily aggressive. Extraordinarily aggressive.
Okay.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
No.
But I don't think Colombia is going to be fascinating, because such a large percentage of the population is dissatisfied with its government. and its economy. You know, the old people are like, you know, our young people have no future, no ability to attend school, no ability to earn a decent wage. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens there.
And it would, as you pointed to, with Colombia's close relationship with the U.S., their standing with NATO, it would be a very interesting domino to see fall. And you know, I mean, it is important to also note, obviously, that there are contradictions within and differences within these different now ruling governments, the new governments and new administrations, and that, you know, some of them have spoken against Venezuela or condemn certain aspects of the Bolivarian Revolution. So keeping that in mind, of course, that it is a heterogeneous group of countries, of course, and group of leaders. So Teri, I just, so that, you know, we really appreciate the time that you've spent with us, and I was just wondering if there's anything else that you would like to add. We don't want to keep you here too long. We know, I'm sure you have multiple other events to be speaking at today.
I'm so happy to have been invited to talk with you this morning. It's been wonderful to see all of you and to work with all of you this morning. You know, there was something in the chat about Colombia and NATO that I saw. You know, it's going to really be interesting to see how this plays out with Colombia being part of NATO, because as the Ukrainian nationals have discovered, is that, well, first of all, they're not a member of NATO, but there's no help for them. And I think that is a huge black eye on all this US, European, NATO rhetoric against Russia, against China, against Iran, everywhere, against Venezuela. That, you know, you're looking at, regardless of, you know, of where we stand, just looking at the structure of what's unfolding in Ukraine. These people were promised something that's never been delivered. I mean, they were basically lied into a proxy war, or what may be unfolding as a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And it's really, really, it makes me sick, actually, just to think on all sides of it, but to basically infer, promise something and then not deliver, which I'm glad NATO's not delivering, but you've got to wonder about the integrity of NATO now, and the US and Europe, when you lead somebody to believe something and then not support them. And that, you know, with anything in life, you lead somebody to believe something that really is not true. And so you have to wonder what that is going to do to the credibility of NATO. Hopefully it's created, you know, its demise. And if that's the case, we've got even better luck in Colombia. But that's got to be going through the minds of Colombian citizens. Like, what is it that, you know, why are we part of this organization that has, you know, no integrity, really? And that's, you know, hopefully we're looking at the demise of NATO. But
do the people of Colombia, are they in favor of the relationship with NATO, or silent on it? Or I would assume it was the government that did that.
You know, so this will be my perception, because when I was there in May of May of last year, we were specifically there to witness and take, you know, testimony from, you know, victims of the Paro, and we were all really, really astonished with how wide the participation was. But we didn't specifically talk about Colombia as a NATO global partner. I will say they do not hate Venezuela the way it is portrayed in Western media. They don't, and they have a common history. They have, you know, common demographics. You know, those border regions. You know, the frontier or the border between Colombia and Venezuela has people with dual citizenship, with people who go back and forth historically, ethnically, and there are also, don't forget, a whole lot of Colombian migrants in Venezuela, because Colombia has been in a civil war for over 50 years. And nobody talks about that much in the North either. So there isn't this unified hatred of the Venezuelans. It's quite different, quite different. Among economic demographics, people just don't hate Venezuela the way it's painted in the States. But I really hope that we're seeing, this NATO thing is going to be fascinating to watch how it plays out in Colombia, whether it gets stronger, whether they dig their heels in and get even more, reactionary, or if it, falls apart. I don't know what the presidential candidates in Colombia are saying about NATO. Are they saying anything at all, Simon? Do you know any of them?
I do not know. I have not followed that aspect closely enough. So just so that people know, the congressional elections in Colombia are not tomorrow, but the following Sunday. And that also includes the kind of inter-party primaries, the consultas, to select which candidates from each coalition will stand in the elections in the first round at the end of May. So good to keep our eyes on Colombia.
Yes.
And yeah, as we start to wrap up here, Teri, I'm wondering if there are any things that you want to plug, any events coming up. I'll just say for my part, following the work of Code Pink more broadly is something that I always learn a lot from Code Pink, and appreciate the work that you all are doing. I mentioned your podcast earlier. I won't.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, but it's a fantastic podcast. I really recommend just bringing a high level of English language analysis, which is on Latin America, which is always needed. Anything else you would like to have people to get involved with?
I would just say, these types of conversations that you host on Saturdays are so important. And just to and to visit countries, if you have the ability to pick up a delegation and go and see for yourself. People always say, well, what sort of follow-up do you expect, Teri, when you do these things? And I say, there's a whole variety of things that people can do. And I'll just give you one example, and I think that links to the importance of intimate conversations like this. That when I was in the delegation I took to Nicaragua in November was principally young, progressive, and leftist journalists, but also several people who have traveled with me before, specifically to Venezuela. And one of the women on that delegation, I'm always extend her an invitation, because her politics are not the same as mine, but we always have these fabulous conversations and we learn from each other. And one of the things that she is able to do is, when she goes back home, she has the capability of getting herself invited to veteran events and book clubs and library events, and typically with audiences who are more center, and in some cases center right. And people say, well, what can I can't get published. I'm not a writer. I can't get published. I don't have a radio show, whatever. It doesn't matter. When you can have an experience and go to your local book club, or even have a dinner party, and someone starts bashing Cuba, and you can say, well, I just got back from there, and it wasn't quite like that. That is political activism. And that is someone who can help change the narrative. And so, nothing is unimportant, and nothing is insignificant. Every little thing that we all do is building, as we like to refer to the Mas and Morena and now Libre in Honduras. Every little thing we do, house to house, friend to friend, family member to family member, that is, educational and influencing, the narrative. piece by piece by piece. It's all important. No matter how big or small you consider your contribution, it is all equally important. Equally important.
And just in that vein, this is of course going to be up on Facebook as well as
Oh,
in
yay.
not too long, and probably just a couple days on the WHAM YouTube, Women Against
Oh, okay.
Madness YouTube channel, so people can go watch it and share it from both those places. I think that's
You know
wonderful.
what? When you have the YouTube link, if you could send that to me or just send me a quick message saying I can get it myself, because
Okay.
I'm happy to circulate that.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah,
That's great.
I'm happy to circulate once we have the link that people, yeah, I'm happy to do that.
And also, we will be doing a report back on our trip to Cuba sometime in April, so on the coffee hour. So, but in the meantime, again, you can go to the WHAM YouTube page and our YouTube channel and look at the incredible videos that Carla took a video of every moment of that trip, and she's now compiling them and has a couple up. So you can virtually go on the trip that the six of us went on. And
Oh, good, good, good. I'm so sorry I wasn't with you.
yeah, we are sorry you weren't with us too. Next time,
Next time, yeah, the change of dates just didn't work.
what do we say next year?
But I'm happy it held together in that yellow.
Yeah. What do we say next year in where?
Same time next year.
Venezuela, Brazil, whatever. Yeah. Thank you so much, Teri.
Oh, thank you so much. Just
And yeah. Anything else? Anybody?
No, just again, thank you so much, Teri, for joining us. We really appreciate it. And if folks are based in the Twin Cities area, please check out the work of Women Against Military Madness and the Solidarity Committee on the Americas.
And also, we are doing the monthly caravans. I forgot to mention that. To Cuba Si Bloqueo No, we have done several of those, and they're always the fourth Sunday of the month, and we will do yet another one the end of March, and we always meet it, for those in Minneapolis know this, the parking lot at South High School, and go up Lake Street, which is a heavily Latino community. So anyway, those are fun. Those are fun. And
yeah,
we do a lot of good.
and important.
Yeah, very important, very important. It's
Yeah.
part of a national effort, actually. And
Yeah, I was going to ask you, is that in conjunction with the group in Miami?
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Of all places that started in Miami. So
No,
we
yeah.
gotta support that.
Mhm.
No
For
question.
sure. No, that's really great that you do that. It's really great.
All
It's really
right.
great, the work that all of you do.
Yeah.
So,
All right, everybody. Thank you. Okay, Carla.
bye.